the point of this ritual is to tell every faction in society that Putin has a majority with him. It's to tell the people who are inside his regime that the people are roughly with him. It's to tell the people who are depoliticized and want to run away from politics, they're resistant to political participation. It's to tell them that most of your neighbors probably kind of side with Putin, so don't get worked up about any possibilities of change. And it's to tell the people who are opposed to Putin, which is up to 30 million people in Russia, stay put, because you're very, very alone.
This is a conversation with Vlad Vexler, a fellow YouTuber and a political philosopher with excellent insight into the Russian state and society. We talked about Alexei Navalny, about Tucker Carlson's Putin interview, about why is there a lack of meaningful opposition to Putin's regime, and what would it take for someone to successfully challenge him, and many other things. It was one of the most interesting conversations I've had on the podcast so far, and it gave me a lot to think about. And I was also able to ask Vlad questions from my supporters on Patreon, who helped me make this happen, and who in return get many perks like this one. If you'd like to join them, you can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to start by talking about the big news from last week. Obviously, the tragic death of Alexei Navalny. And I think that by now we've had some time for the news to sink in. And from your point of view, what is the meaning of his death? What should we take away from it? And what I mean specifically is, do you think that what we've witnessed was some kind of a major turn, something that will have real tangible consequences, or something that was in the long term sort of a marginal chapter in history that will be remembered, but not as something that really changed things in a major way?
I think that over 2,000 years ago, Aristotle said that you can't judge a person's happiness until after they've died. And we can't judge Navalny's legacy yet. We're going to see what happens over the next few years. And it's not plausible to see how his death could create extraordinary consequences on the Russian space in the short term. But it might well do that in the medium term. And we have to simply wait and observe where history lands us. In terms of what the meaning is as far as the trajectory of the regime goes, this is a regime that is migrating from authoritarian capitalism into a more totalitarian shape, into a certain kind of war footing. It's doing this in incremental steps, and we can see that as one more step like that. And I think that it also indicates that the fate of a lot of people who are considered enemies of the Putin regime is going to be expressed more and more frequently in physical destruction in the future. So I think we're seeing the regime at the beginning of a process of a few totalitarian turns that are going to get much darker and much less pleasant.
Do you think there's a particular reason for why it happened now? Why was Navalny killed now when it could have happened really at any point while he was in prison, but even before that?
His partner, Yulia, has said that they're going to come up with something and tell us something in the next few weeks. That will inform our understanding of what happened and perhaps, therefore, also why it happened. But Putin tried to do this in 2020. It didn't work out for him for fairly contingent reasons. Navalny's plane landed in a very short period of time. There was an ambulance ready. They managed to pressure the medical system to release him to Germany. And quite what may have triggered it in February as opposed to in April, we don't know. But one of the plausible candidates is clearly the legitimation ritual that Putin is going to go through in March. We shouldn't exaggerate its importance, but we should also see that that's a ritual that is absolutely central to the perceived legitimacy of that regime. The point is to demonstrate to every demographic in Russia that the majority are with Putin. Now, that might not be true, but the point is to create that image. And along that journey, the regime already had a very serious bump because a Kremlin sanctioned candidate failed to achieve the kerfuffle they wanted to create for the Russian opposition. The Kremlin was keen on Boris Nadezhdin running, the man who's just failed to get registered, in order that the Russian opposition would quarrel about whether to go with him or go against him, and they unified. The expectation was that Navalny's camp would go against Nadezhdin, and that didn't happen. So they feel they've scored an own goal, and they may well be having anxious thoughts. They're not thoughts about losing power, but they're thoughts about, nevertheless, their safety and their sustained stability. The only thing I would add is that I don't recognize this decision as being entirely logical for Putin, certainly now, in terms of a cold cost-benefit analysis. I think there's a very big place here for vengeance. There's a very big place here for a certain kind of satisfaction. So abstractly, Putin would probably talk about Navalny in terms of Putin's own safety and eliminating anything that might threaten that. But in reality, it isn't clear Putin is going to be, or even is going to feel more safe without Navalny, but he's certainly going to feel more satisfied. And maybe a certain level of paranoia of his will be allayed, because Putin has the thought that a circumstance could arise in which Navalny comes out of jail in a way that Putin can't any longer control. And that situation, Putin might think it's unlikely, but it's possible as far as he is concerned. And that would be a situation that would threaten not Putin's power, but even his life in Putin's view. And so that that fear may have exercised him more than perhaps it would if he were doing a cold benefit analysis, which may have led him to keep Navalny alive longer.
I want to touch on something that you've mentioned, and that's the topic of the elections. Or I love the term that you've the way that you've named it, because it's obviously not elections as we understand them in the West and democratic societies. And I wonder, how do you think that we should see this legitimation ritual? Do you think that Putin will have his wish, or does it look now like he will have his wish of seeming as the legitimate representative of the Russian society?
I think the conflict that the folks in the regime have had is, do we run a very modest ship here without any thrills, and then we'll be safe? And there was another faction, presumably in the regime, that said, let's add some thrills, like Mr. Nadezhdin. They added a few thrills, and they didn't work out particularly well so far. But that doesn't mean that the regime won't get through this ritual fairly comfortably. The difference basically is how much politicization of the kind the regime does not like will occur during this process. And the answer to that question is either virtually none or relatively little. Now, both of these scenarios are entirely sustainable and entirely conducive to the regime's stability as far as we're concerned today. So what is important, I think, about the election is to understand why the regime still needs it. But it's not an election that's worth studying so as to learn whether the Putin regime could be massively destabilized by it. That's not going to happen.
And well, let me ask, why do you think that Putin's regime needs it?
Because Putin is the only political institution in the country with perceived legitimacy. And the point of this ritual is to tell every faction in society that Putin has a majority with him. It's to tell the people who are inside his regime that the people are roughly with him. It's to tell the people who are depoliticized and want to run away from politics, they're resistant to political participation. It's to tell them that, most of your neighbors probably kind of side with Putin, so don't get worked up about any possibilities of change. And it's to tell the people who are opposed to Putin, which is up to 30 million people in Russia, stay put because you're very, very alone. So it's possible that this ritual is suspended in a few years and Putin becomes a kind of Tsar who does not need this. But at the moment, it's absolutely central because the regime's own explanation of why it's there is completely dependent on various kinds of exercises that allegedly demonstrate that the majority of the population are with him.
But it seems to me that perhaps in the recent months, we have seen increase in politicization and perhaps increasing signs of discontent in the Russian society, whether it's the protests of the wives and mothers of the mobilized soldiers or protests in Russian regions. Those are not protests that would be aimed against the war or against Putin or against the regime. But it seems to me that perhaps there are increasing signs of discontent in the Russian society. And I think it's quite interesting what Mark Galeotti often points out, which is that we probably in Russia shouldn't expect that some kind of a movement that will really threaten the regime will start for political reasons, but rather that it will be for reasons that are much more understandable for the majority of the society. That it's going to be something like protests against mobilization or protests against worsening economic situation. And I would wonder what's your read on that?
I think that we are very far away from existential levels of politicization on the Russian space that might threaten the Putin regime. And what you're going to need for that is a coming together of a crack in the regime greater than what we've seen so far, and then significant grassroots momentum, possibly combined with somebody offering leadership and maybe even a bit of a vision. And if all of that is in place, what will materialize is a sense of agency. So agency means a sense that if you do X, Y will follow. And if Y follows, Z follows, and then change is possible. All the protests that you've named are not of that kind. They treat the basic political reality like the rings of Saturn. They're not something you can be for or against, they're simply there. So all of these protests, including what happened in Bashkortostan, has stayed inside that bracket. So I'm not seeing any significant politicization of the type that I'm just trying to capture. That's one where people feel that they have a capacity to act and make a difference. And when that happens, people will actually begin taking risks to make change. So partly Russians are not acting because they're afraid, but actually an even bigger part is there's just no account of agency. What is it that one should do, and with whom and how and when, to bring about some kind of meaningful change? That picture is completely absent at the moment, and I'm not seeing it show up at all in the little bit of political mobilization around the wives of the mobilized or in the regional protests. We need to wait longer until this happens. Eventually it can. I mean, societies do not stay radically depoliticized forever, especially when they're experiencing extreme turbulence and when they're led by a reckless and somewhat apocalyptic regime. But today, I'm not seeing any of it.
So do you think it's just about time? Or do you think there are some requirements that need to be met for there to be a situation in which some kind of a significant and meaningful revolt against the regime might happen?
Well, this sense of agency is partly about objective facts, is making a change possible by taking certain kinds of action. Partly it is about thinking it makes it so, right? I mean, if 10 million Russians suddenly felt that taking action is efficacious, that would change the degree to which taking action is indeed efficacious in reality. But I think that what galvanizes that sense of agency is a crack in the regime, possibly various kinds of ill-assorted, ill-defined mobilization of the kind that perhaps Mark was talking about. And then on top of that, somebody offering an alternative picture that is coherent and compelling and aimed at all factions of society, not aimed just at, for instance, the sliver of the liberal democratic folks. That's one of the things that, for instance, was palpably missing in Prigozhin's mutiny. He didn't offer a significant alternative to the country. If he did, he could have done a lot more damage to Putin.
Was Navalny offering a meaningful alternative?
My analysis is that he came closest to, but wasn't. And the reason I say that is because an alternative really means offering something to the liberal democratic faction of society, offering something to people who are more sympathetic with Putin, offering something to the depoliticized folks, offering something to the army, offering something to folks who are connected with the security state, and doing it very concretely. What exactly do you want to implement and how are you going to do it? And Navalny knew that he needed to do this. He tried to do this. He got further than anybody else. But on balance, I would say that he remained a master of politicization, but he never quite supplemented that extraordinary capacity for politicization with offering a meaningful alternative. Too often, what he offered was a kind of elaboration of the idea that we should live like the civilized West. And for me, that wasn't directed enough to particular groups in society, and it wasn't specific enough. I mean, even if we look at ourselves in the West, we're not all the same thing. So, what exactly are you going to take from Czechia? What exactly are you going to take from Belgium? What are you not going to take from France, and why? And so we wanted more of that specificity to be comfortable to label what Navalny was offering a real and meaningful three-dimensional alternative picture. Somebody needs to do that. I rather cruelly have the view that the last person to offer that was Gorbachev. That's consistent with his image being, with his image of an alternative being unrealizable and unsustainable, but he was offering one.
I think one thing that makes everything we're talking about a lot more complicated, and including coming up with a viable alternative, is that the Russian opposition, which Navalny was part of, is notoriously divided. And I wonder, why do you think that is? That despite having a clear enemy, the Russian opposition still remains completely unable to act in a way that it could use the collective force of everyone who is opposing Putin.
I think partly it's because we've got a global crisis of depoliticization. We are struggling ourselves to form a strategy toward Ukraine. We have virtually no strategy toward the Russian space. And the Russian opposition are in a somewhat similar predicament of failing to come to terms with the political challenges they face. And instead, they've ended up substituting handling those for engaging in activities that risk being more moral and journalistic than political. So that's one thing. Second thing is that there's a feeling that there is not much anybody can do at this point. There is a feeling that the kind of regime you're looking at needs to be either tapped out at the early onset point or when it's crumbling. Perhaps in the kind of state that Lukashenko has been in for a few years. He wasn't toppled, but he may have been. And so there is the realization that there isn't so much that one can do. And I think the third element is that while everybody without question accepted Navalny's moral authority, and I don't think the squabbles got in the way of that. I mean, even the people who disagreed with Navalny recognized his moral stature. But Navalny himself had a personality disposition and a theory of change that mitigated against coalition formation. I think Navalny was keen to keep a cogent and integrated team that was apart from everybody else in case an opportunity to take power arose and he could just say, we're ready, let's just transplant ourselves in there. So he had a certain kind of quasi-Bolshevist theory of transformation, which made him keener on keeping his folks apart from everybody else. And then on top of that, Navalny had, together with his extraordinary qualities of a kind of physical freedom and staggering courage and moral clarity, he also had ambition the size of 11 aircraft hangars. And that also got in the way of him registering anything on the radar that he wasn't clear about in terms of how it got him closer to a position where he could exercise power. So I think all of these factors played a role, but I think your diagnosis is completely correct. The question now is going to be, are they going to unify? Because a Navalny in spirit is going to be more compatible with them all coming together than a physically embodied Navalny was.
I guess that's going to be one of the ways in which his legacy could work, but whether that's going to happen, we'll have to see. One last thing about Navalny that I'd be curious to know your opinion on is one of the quite frequently appearing opinions that I've seen regarding his death was that what it shows us is that Putin's regime is weak, that it's a sign of weakness that he's decided to, as you say, move towards physically eliminating his opponents. And I wonder whether that's true, and I'd love to hear your opinion, because you could also argue that it's exactly the opposite, and that it means that it feels strong and confident enough that there will be no consequences, that there will be no punishments from anyone, that they can just do whatever they please without barely any limits.
I think that we've got to be careful about what being strong and being weak means for a regime like that. We tend to think of that in terms of what our societies look like. So I'm sitting in London, and I can tell you that the Labour Party is likely to win the next election. I can tell you some of what they're going to do. I can tell you ways in which they're going to succeed and fail. I can tell you how debate about electoral reform is going to come to the fore in Britain over the coming years. And I can make some guesses about the stability of British democracy 5-10 years from now. I could be wrong, but the process is institutional enough, contained enough for that conversation to be meaningful. But a regime like the Putin regime could survive another 15 years relatively stably. At the same time, it could have collapsed in the summer with the Prigozhin mutiny. If Prigozhin had marched on Moscow with a bigger column of military gear, if that column didn't stop, and if instead of eviscerating the competence of the regime, Prigozhin supplemented that with a story about what his Russia would look like, what he wants Russia to look like, he could have posed an existential threat to the Putin regime. This is a regime that can sustain for a long time. It can also be swept away by a series of contingencies that develop over the course of 6 or 12 months. And so, what does stability and strength and weakness mean in that context? And so I think that's one of the interesting points, that so often we project the way we think about our relatively stable democratic societies onto these entirely different regimes. But in that context, what strength and weakness means becomes a different thing. What I think Putin had in his head as an image about Navalny is what we've just touched upon earlier, and that is that a circumstance could arise under which Navalny could be an existential threat to Putin's power and to Putin's life. And Putin feels that he's on top now, so why not take advantage of this and act? Now, I don't think Putin has a particular percentage number in his head of how likely that situation is to arise, but I think he is fearful about it and he has paranoid thoughts about it. So I think that's as far as we can go. I mean, this is a regime that is doing quite a lot to self-immolate. Eventually, it is a project that will collapse. It cannot sustain itself for a long time with Putin passing the baton on to somebody else. But how long this is going to last, we don't know. How dramatic it's going to be, we don't know. And the worst case scenario for this is that we go down with it too. We hope that that's terribly unlikely. But these are the possibilities we're looking at. And therefore, I think we can't talk about the same level of predictability when it comes to the Putin regime as we would about the government of Germany, let's say.
Let me take a quick break here from the conversation to tell you about my Patreon. I do these interviews in my free time because I enjoy them, but if you want to help me make more of them, consider becoming a supporter. In return, you will be able to ask my future guests your questions, get Patreon-only episodes and bonus content, and watch all the interviews couple days early and without ads. You can go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics or use the link in the description to check it out. But whatever you do, thank you for watching. And now, back to the conversation. That's completely true. I think the complicated or the tricky thing about any authoritarian or totalitarian regime is that they always seem like they're gonna remain in place forever until they suddenly and immediately collapse, or at least that's how it often has been in history. But moving away from Navalny, there's been another recent development that I would love to hear your thoughts on, and that was the Tucker Carlson Putin interview. And I wonder if you've seen the interview, what were your thoughts on it, and what do you think was the main reason that Putin decided to put on a show like that?
I thought that it worked out very well for the Kremlin as far as the fact that the interview took place goes, because there's going to be clips circulating endlessly that are going to make an impact. But as far as the actual content of the interview, I felt it was a terrible flop. In fact, Putin did an interview a couple of days later in Russian, where he made all of the destructive points that could have had a minor but nevertheless palpable impact on our democracies that it didn't make in Tucker's interview. The things he didn't say to Tucker, but he said in that other interview, was that our leaders in the West are betraying us and they are our enemies, that our political institutions are opaque, untransparent, and cannot be trusted. So he delivered on all of these destructive points he didn't give to Tucker. My view is that Putin simply didn't prep for it. And the first 35 minutes of the interview, I've watched the whole thing in English and then some of it in Russian as well. The first 35 minutes of the interview were not strategic, they were compulsive. Putin just needed to rave on about his sort of imaginary history textbook. And I think that was one of the most telling things about that interview, that this was a man who couldn't bear being interrupted when he went on about all of this stuff. And Putin wasn't like this to begin with. But sometime between maybe 2010 to 2014, he took a kind of missionary turn. He began fantasizing about his alikeness with Tsar Alexander III. He began to think of himself as something like the incarnation of the cultural destiny of all Russians, embodied in the shape of a single individual, a kind of Wagnerian self-image. And that has got enormously worse during the pandemic period, in my view, during Putin's isolation from 2020 on. And that's quite scary, because I thought that that first 30, 35 minutes was compulsive and sincere.
That's what it seemed like to me as well. And I completely agree that I think Putin sort of missed the opportunity to really deliver the classic Kremlin propaganda. And I think that even Tucker was quite disappointed that Putin didn't take up some of the clues that he was giving him and didn't hammer the points in as much as he probably hoped for. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which is more on Tucker himself and what he represents. Because basically, at least the way it seems to me, there's this growing movement on the right that we're now seeing in the Republican Party, but we have seen in Europe for quite a long time, which is, to put it mildly, very sympathetic to Russia. And in, at least in Tucker's version, it tries to say that maybe the Russian system is equally as bad or even better than as the Western one. And I wonder, how do you see that, and where do you think that came from? Because this affinity to Russia and to uh, totalitarian regimes in general has sort of been a tradition on the far left, but now we're seeing the same thing on the far right.
I think that the affinity on the far left has historically been about anti-Americanism more than about particular tyrannies that were elevated or under criticized. And I think we've seen the same with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On the right, there is a very significant pattern going on all over Europe. It's been going on longer in Eastern Europe, but it's going on everywhere now. And that's a pattern of the right splitting off into a kind of constitutional right, a right that is still committed to democratic process, is committed to counter-majoritarian institutions, the kind of right that we thought of as the right a couple of decades ago. Today, we have this split off between these constitutional conservatives and people who talk the conservative talk, but in fact are out to break the democratic system. They are anti-constitutional folks, and they are often entrepreneurially exploiting the crisis of trust we're all living through in Western democracies. I think we are living through probably the greatest crisis of trust we've experienced since the European revolutions of 1848. I think people are losing faith in their political institutions. I don't think that is because people have become irrational or indulged. I think there are real complex social forces driving this. This is also driving our untethering from truthful discourse. In many ways, people are finding truth socially oppressive and incompatible with their expression of their sense of political agency. We need to explore why that's so, and we need to take it very, very seriously. But we also need to recognize that we have a lot of people who are simply exploiting this situation. And Tucker is somebody who makes a living as a kind of political entrepreneur in these currents of public opinion that most dramatically express a loss of faith and a loss of trust in our public institutions. We're going to see people like him more and more, and sadly, we're going to see people like him more and more in power. Now, I think the reason your question is so difficult and important is because then we're forced into a conversation. How much is this just a local problem? Or how much is this a matter of the Kremlin interfering in our societies? Now, obviously, we'd agree it's a local problem, but the question arises, how far is the Kremlin trying, and how far is the Kremlin effective in disrupting our democracies? And because of our loss of trust, we're unable to have a collective conversation about this. There are some of us who simply deny the reality of Russian interference. And then there are others who dramatize it to such a degree that it comes out that Trump's victory in 2016 is a product of Russian interference in US society, which is actually a terrifying position to take, because it means that you are externalizing all kinds of organic challenges in our democracies and simply blaming them on malign foreign interference plus the gullibility and irrationality of a segment of the population. What's terrifying about that is that you can actually witness your democracy collapse without doing anything about it, because the more toxic things become, the more you blame it on malign foreign interference, and the more convinced you are that this isn't an organic domestic challenge you need to address. So this is a balance we've got to strike. And so my recommendation is always to take Russian interference seriously, but also to weigh its efficacy seriously, and to appreciate what vast amount of democratic damage we can do to ourselves by calling a 0.5% impact of Russian interference a 50% impact. You know, if there is a 50% impact, we've got to talk about it and we've got to name it. But to radically misrepresent the degree to which Russian interference is degenerating our democracies is itself a really successful way to let a lot of the democratic fabric we still have slip through our fingers. So the question with Tucker is Tucker responding to various currents in American political culture and sort of sticky taping Putin and Russia and the war into that? Or are we looking at Tucker as a sort of walking instantiation of Kremlin interference, such that we can, sort of accurately call him a Russian asset and a product of foreign forces we need to stop from penetrating our democratic life? And I think that balance needs to be struck. And my recommendation is to put the weight on the domestic and the local explanation, while also being truthful about the fact that it is an aspiration of the Kremlin to undermine our democracies, and that's more or less openly has been their enterprise since 2014. So it's one of those difficult things for us, because you've got to keep two things in mind, and if we put one of them too centrally, we hurt ourselves.
I think those were some really good points. I couldn't agree more on the complicated issue of Russian or foreign interference, because that's something that I deal with a lot and think about a lot in my job outside of YouTube and outside of podcasting. And yes, I think that both of these extremes, either denying it completely or seeing Russian interference behind every single thing that happens, are both really damaging, and we're still not really able to have a rational discussion about the extent of it. And on Tucker, I think I agree that he's mainly someone who's a grifter who's just exploiting and attacking the system for his own benefit. But what I always find fascinating is that people like him, people like Tucker, and I think even Trump, you could say the same thing about him, are attacking and destroying the very same system that works so well for them, and thanks to which they managed to get to where they are.
They're using democracy to undermine democracy. I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Exactly, but I think the result that they will end up with is probably not going to be one that they would be very happy about themselves. But I think I'd like to use the remaining time that we have, even though I have many other questions, but I don't want to hold you here forever, and I think I might save them for another interview that hopefully we will have. But I'd like to use the remaining time to ask you questions from my from the good people on my Patreon and my supporters, because they've asked some really good questions that I think are worth asking. And one of them that I thought was particularly interesting was that, and I would really love to hear your thoughts, is from Tobias, who's asking whether, because of how active and visible you are, whether you fear about your own life ever, since Russia is taking actions against people who in their from their or who they view as quote unquote traitors, and if you took any preventative actions. I think that's in the context of the fact that you're a British citizen, but you were born in the Soviet Union. I don't know if you, I assume you don't have Russian citizenship anymore, but if that's something that ever crossed your mind, that perhaps what you're doing might be dangerous to you personally.
No, or barely at all. The only thing I could say here is that the degree to which the regime goes after people is often so bizarre and so sort of ill assorted in terms of their prioritization that it's worth being aware. But my reality is that I left the country during the Soviet period still. I was never a Russian citizen, and I overwhelmingly address a Western audience. I mean, on the main channel historically, we've had maybe 250,000 returning audience monthly, and less on the chat channel. But we're talking literally hundreds or 1,000 or two of Ukrainians or Russians who watch me. It's normally 1% Ukrainian, 0.5% Russian. So we're overwhelmingly a Scandinavian, North American, Western and Central European audience. And I think that really puts me outside of that ecosystem of people who are broadcasting against the Kremlin. And moreover, I do not speak in an activist way. I'm not screaming about policy implementation, though I do, of course, imply what those might be. But I think for all of these reasons, I haven't thought too deeply about this. But the only qualifier here would be that these guys are pretty weird, and they can make a list of 1,000 people and somehow prioritize person 999 over person number 7. But I still think I'm outside of that entire ecosystem.
I think I agree, and I think that's good to hear that you feel that way. Another question is, what are the main psychological differences between Russia today and the Soviet Union back then, and what are the similarities? I assume that's could be between the differences between the leadership or between how regular people tend to think and feel.
So, of course, one major difference is that the Soviet project was a deformation of a kind of hard left regime. This is an extreme hard right tyranny. So these regimes are profoundly unlike each other. There's very little continuity compared with the discontinuity that there is between a Putin and a Brezhnev. I think that the degree of radical depoliticization in Russian society is extraordinarily striking. It is a bit continuous with the lived experience of folks in the Soviet Union who felt, for goodness sake, how do I make sure that I keep the state out of my life in an intrusive and inconvenient, if not in a scary way? But the degree of depoliticization that's taken place in Russia over the past quarter century is extreme. And in large part, it has been generated by a positive political project by the Kremlin. How do we bring it about that the people have the worst odds possible of getting any kind of enterprise of working together for the public good off the ground? So that unbelievably radical degree of depoliticization is new. Even if you ask how Soviet folks felt about the war in Afghanistan in the 80s, you could get a sense of, public opinion on that. But today, most Russians do not have a view on Putin's war. A large minority or a small majority of Russians genuinely has no view about the war. This is sometimes brought out if you look at polls done by very good projects who know how to work with polls properly, like Russian Field. What they sometimes do is put as question 5 something like, if Putin decided to continue the war for a long time and made a speech about that tomorrow, how would you feel about this? And question 19 is, if Putin decided to completely withdraw from Ukraine tomorrow, how would you feel about this? And often the answers come back at 70% support for whatever Putin would do. So this is an extraordinary externalization of opinion about something that is utterly existential to the country's future. I mean, the country is destroying itself at the moment. It's not just destroying Ukraine. And yet, something like, let's say, 40 to 60% of the population are resisting to having an opinion about it. They have a certain kind of hope that what is going on is not completely insane. But that hope works like this. It's about inferred justification. I have no idea what's happening, but hopefully the folks in the Kremlin have some reasons for what they're doing. But if they don't, that's really scary. But that's so scary that I don't want to think about that either. And even if that's true, I don't know what I could do about it. So that is utterly radical. And I think that is a global crisis of depoliticization, of which Russia is, at least to my knowledge, the most sort of eye-wateringly extreme example. So I think we could carry on that list, but I think that's enough of a taste of a couple of points.
I think the final question, and that I think would be a good one to end it with, is on the topic of the war, and in particular on what is your view on ending the war, and what is your idea of how this war will end, and how can we achieve peace? And I guess if you think that there is any other way than purely a complete and utter military defeat of Russia on the battlefield, or if there is any other way out of this.
Well, this is a question about whether negotiations are an available avenue in part. The Putin regime may well want, or at least in certain moods may well want, negotiations, but they would want them as a means of trying to win the war. I'm saying this because I have a special view about an issue that's really at the heart of the question you've asked about, and that's the view that for the Putin regime, regime security and foreign escalation are constitutively tied. That's not just to say that foreign escalation is something Putin is committed to, and that's his personal opinion and belief. It's that he is to some degree co-opted, some non-trivial degree, just co-opted into that path. And insofar as there's any disagreement between experts that you want to start by exploring, it's disagreement around the question of how far regime security for the Putin regime is tied to war. So I would say that the majority of experts on Russia think it's pretty closely tied. Some people are a little bit more skeptical of this, and they think that the link is made too tightly by perhaps that majority of Russia experts and commentators. So, for instance, I think that I am more convinced about the tightness of that link than Mark Galeotti is. Mark is a little bit more open that link is less tight. But the issue that's debated here is the issue of how central is regime security, is war to the regime's conception of its security, domestic security, keeping power. My view is that the Putin regime is setting itself up for a big and existential confrontation with the West. It doesn't have to materialize in a war with NATO, but it means that we're talking about a resetting, a gradual resetting of the economy, a gradual resetting of the education system, a gradual resetting of society. I think if you look at the top 5, 6, 7 people in the regime, they believe that they have no choice about this business of a major struggle with the West, and they believe they're right at the beginning of it. And moreover, they believe that the challenges our democracies are facing are a kind of historical inevitability that we can't do anything about. In other words, it's not just that they recognize, like you and I might, that Western democracy is experiencing fragility, decline, and a crisis of trust. It's that folks in and around Putin and Putin have what I call a kind of Fukuyamian in reverse view about Western decline. They think that it is relatively imminent, and they think that it is inevitable, that Western democracies are going to collapse. And they are anticipating a time when a significant confrontation with the West may be more viable. And for them, that would be a time when Trump's in power in the States, Le Pen's in power in France, somebody else in power in the UK or Germany. And these are folks who are going to be fairly ready to give up on the unity of the NATO alliance, and so on and so forth. So these are the thoughts they are having, and these are the things they are doing. And I do also think that a peacetime Putin regime is inadmissible to Putin. That would constitute an existential threat to his power. Part of the reason he started the war was because he thinks this. So that is my opinion. But the debate, people who would disagree with me would challenge me around whether I've made that link between foreign escalation and regime security too strong. But on the picture that I've just given you, the idea of negotiating with Putin being something that's going to work out well is virtually absurd. However, that doesn't mean we have an easy solution, because we're not supporting Ukraine sufficiently. Our support for Ukraine is to some degree exhausting itself. And we may well be forced, and Ukraine may well be forced into outcomes that are unsustainable for some of the reasons that I've outlined, but nevertheless happen because we do not have the commitment and we do not have the clarity of strategy to push this through.
I agree completely. I think one thing I might add is, or at least in my view, is that while I agree that Putin does need a perpetual conflict, I think another issue is the intensity of the conflict, and I think that at times he might benefit from lowering the intensity, and then amping it up again to perhaps freeze the conflict for a bit, help the economy, and then amp it up again once the regime feels like it's more ready for another round.
Let me just add that even when we talk about a potential conflict, direct conflict between Russia and NATO, which I think is a possibility, but in my video about it, I said because of the contingencies of history, we probably won't get there. But I do think it's a possibility. But that's not a possibility that Putin sees in terms of World War III or in terms of a large scale confrontation. He rather sees it as the appearance of a moment, which he thinks isn't here yet, in which the West is so weak that it is overwhelmingly likely that engaging in some kind of intervention, for instance, in the Baltic states, isn't going to escalate into a global war and will instead result in something like the dissolution of NATO. Putin's personal view is that we're not there today, but he has the belief that we will inevitably get to that stage. And the challenge for us is, does that mean that he's going to just convince himself that he's there at some point, um, um, no matter what the reality on the ground is, or is he going to be realistic and avoid engaging with NATO if NATO is actually going to be more responsive than he would like? I I think there are concerns there because of the degree of isolation, because of the degree of paranoia, and because of the degree of um, various kinds of apocalyptic thinking that play a role in the Kremlin. So I think we should be concerned about this. But what Putin wants with us is not a full-scale war. He precisely wants a conflict where a war does not happen because we're weak.
I think on that note, perhaps to end it with, because I could have this discussion for many more hours, but I think that he didn't want a full scale war or a war lasting several years in Ukraine either. And he thought it will be a very quick special operation that will cut off the head in Kiev and Ukraine will fall. And he miscalculated because he completely misanalyzed the situation, and his the advice that he was given was probably completely wrong. So I think the danger is that the same miscalculation might happen when he tries to challenge the West, as you say.
Or that he is right and we won't respond.
I think I still remain optimistic on that note, but
Let's
um
hope you're right.
let's do hope for that. Well, I guess maybe we will see and find out. But I'm not gonna take any more of your time. Thank you so much for this. I have much to think about from your answers, and I hope that we'll get to do this another time again.
I'm sure we will. Thanks so much for having me, Dom.